Fantastic. A huge congratulations to Edwin again and the family. It's great to have friends and family of Edwin here, and a huge welcome to you and anyone else visiting. And as a church, we've been going through a preaching series called Encountering God, and we're continuing on that theme today. And I didn't think we could come to an end of this series without looking at the passage that we are today, where there's kind of three encounters that we look at. The first is encountering the brokenhearted, and at the risk of some people rolling their eyes and being, Colin always talks about the broken-hearted. Bear with us, we're going to crack on with that. But then through encountering the broken-hearted, we then get to encounter Jesus. And in this passage it says, from encountering Jesus, it has a direct impact into how we ultimately encounter God. And we're going to dive into Matthew, and it starts in Matthew 23, where Jesus has just completed one of his hardest hitting messages to the religious leaders of the time. And he says to them, the temple that we're standing in today is going to be destroyed. And this was a bombshell moment. This was the very heart of Jewish identity. Jews from all over the world had gathered to build this temple. It was known in ancient times as one of the most magnificent structures you could imagine, and yet Jesus says it's going to be destroyed and pass. And as Jesus walks out of the temple with his disciples, who are almost in disbelief, they say to Jesus, look at this building, as if to say, can you really be serious? And Jesus says to them, I promise you, I tell you the truth, this will be destroyed. And there was prophetic, historic accuracy into what Jesus was saying, because 40 years later, the temple was destroyed. But Jesus was pointing to something far more significant. In the verses that follow, he was talking about the reality that there will be things in our life that we put our trust in that will pass. And Jesus was saying to his followers, as followers of me, I want you to invest in the things of this life that are permanent. Not just things that pass, but a permanent legacy. The passage that we look at today gives us a strong indication as what God feels is permanent legacy. And the disciples are still a little bit shocked and confused by this. And they say, God, Jesus, can you unpack this a little bit more? And so Jesus starts talking about what it's going to be like when we stand before God or when Jesus returns. And he speaks in a number of stories. And we don't have time to go through all of them. But one of them is a famous one that we've probably, many of us have heard, even if we don't come to church often. And it's this parable where there's this master. And he's going away for a bit of time. And he calls his servants and he says to his servants, I want you to look after my estate. And he says to one of the servants, I'm going to give you 5 bags of silver, and to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag of silver. And the master leaves them and he goes on his way, and then sometime later he returns and he gathers these 3 servants together and he says to them all, okay, let's see what you did with the bags of silver that I gave you. And the one with 5 and the one with 2 said, well, we invested it and we have doubled it. That's good news. That's the kind of thing Mark in a Treasury PCC meeting wants to hear. Doubled the investment. Good times. Mark is waving his hands, rejoicing. But then he says to the one who was given 1 bag, and what did you do? And there's this awkward kind of moment where he kind of shuffles, and then he looks to his master and he said, well, I went in the garden and I dug a hole and I put it there to keep it safe, and so I'm just giving you 1 back. And the master looks at him almost with disbelief and says, come again, can you repeat that? And he says, well, I buried it and I'm just giving you back the 1 bag of silver. And the master becomes furious and he says, this is ridiculous, get out. And he takes the bag of silver and it gives some to someone else. And I always thought that was a little bit harsh. Some of us are more or less risk averse than others, and maybe he was just trying to play it safe. And yet when you look at commentaries of the economic kind of climate of that time, there wasn't really any risk in making an investment. It's no coincidence that the other 2 doubled, because it said doubling your investment at that time was fairly normal. It wasn't that he was risk averse, it was that he really wasn't that bothered about what his master had given him. We'll come back to that parable shortly, but it sets us up for where we're going with Matthew 25:31. And this is where we get a powerful insight as to how we're going to encounter God's glory. It says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him. We've spent a lot of time in this encounter series looking at the intimate one-to-one relationship we have with Jesus as our friend and as in close intimacy, and that is a huge part of our faith. But we also need to recognize that we're going to come and encounter the God of glory. I don't know how many of you saw Elton John set at Glastonbury on the final night on the Pyramid stage. Did anyone see that? Maybe even some of you went to visit it. One of my friends was there and said it was extraordinary. As the drone kind of went up, you could see people for far as the eye could see. About 100,000 people gathered. And yet in the book of Revelation, John says there's not going to be 100,000 angels. There will be 10,000 by 10,000, 100 million angels by the throne of God and all the nations. And in that context, we will go before God. We will meet with God. I remember growing up, there was a song, some of you remember, that we used to sing, I can only imagine what it'll be like, surrounded by your glory, what will my heart feel? And with that image of the throne of God and 100 million angels, I have no idea. But in this passage we're about to open, we get a really clear insight from Jesus, the only time he speaks into this, as to what is going to happen. And interestingly, Jesus says that when we meet with God, he's not going to ask for our theological stance on this issue or what was our favorite Bethel or worship album. This is what happens when the king separates people to his left and to his right. It says in verse 34, the king will say to those at his right hand, come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Isn't that an incredible invitation? Don't we want to be the people where God says you get to inherit this glory in this kingdom? And here's the reason. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. And the passage goes on to say that the righteous were confused by this and said, well, Lord, when have we ever seen you hungry and fed you or visited you in prison? And Jesus says, surely what you did for the last of these, you did for me. And then the king looks to the other side and he says to them, I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty, you didn't give me a drink. I was a stranger and you didn't welcome me. I was naked and you didn't clothe me. I was sick and in prison and you didn't visit me. And there were people on that side say, but when did we ever see you in that context? And Jesus says, truly I tell you, just as you did not do it for one of the least of these, you did not do it for me. When we stand before all the nations, 100 million angels and the glory of God on his throne, the question he's going to ask is, did you love the brokenhearted? Now we need to pause here and just put this in context with the rest of Scripture, because we're not in any way proclaiming that this is a legalistic checklist where if you feed the hungry then suddenly you're going to be saved. As it says in Ephesians 2, 8-10, for it is by grace that we have been saved, not by works. And it's absolutely critical that we understand that. But Jesus isn't telling us to do these things to earn salvation, but Jesus is expecting us to do them as necessary evidence of our salvation. 1 John 3, 16, 20 talks into this, where John says, we know what God's love was by this, because Jesus laid down his life for us. And so we ought to lay down our lives for brothers and sisters. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother and sister in need and yet refuses to help? There was a study that I may have referenced before, so apologies if you've heard it, but someone did an interview with a whole load of people who claimed to be strong followers of Jesus. And within the questionnaire, he said, how many of you think Jesus spent time with the poor? And over 80% of them said yes. And then further in the interview, he kind of was a little sneaky and snuck in another question. And how many of you hang out with the poor? And less than 2% said yes. Shane Claiborne, in response to that study, said that he learned a powerful lesson, that we can admire and worship Jesus without actually doing what he did. We can applaud what he preached and stood for without actually caring for the same things. We can adore his cross without taking up ours. Jesus isn't telling us to do these things to earn salvation, but he is saying they're necessary evidence of our salvation. Francis Chan said that Jesus expects us to treat the poor and the desperate as if they were Christ himself. In light of this passage, he says, is there a more tangible way to show love to Jesus than caring for those who are mentioned in Matthew 25? If we want to encounter Jesus, we have to encounter the brokenhearted. And when I look back at my life, there have certainly been amazing moments, even in the course of this morning worshiping, where we encounter God in worship and prayer. But if I look at some of the most poignant moments, it hasn't been in big festivals with lights and all of that. It's been in the humble moments of brokenness with people. I remember when I was growing up, our church used to go to Romania, and I became friends with a little street boy. He was tiny and very thin, and one day he invited me to his house, and when I went there, it was literally just a bin behind some shops. He was so hardened that he used to put cigarettes out on his hand. And yet in that moment, Jesus was there. Or I've preached sometimes before and shared how we used to do prison ministry in Haiti, and we'd go to the cells which were smaller than this kind of bit in the front of the church, but would have over 100 men in it. And you would look at them through the bars in the prison, and they say, what can we do for you? And they said, just pray. And yet when we were praying, we weren't just looking at prisoners. It very much felt like you were looking at Jesus. It's one of the most extraordinary privileges we have in life. It is something of permanent legacy, not of just passing fun. And it's this extraordinary privilege that Jesus invites us into. And recognizing both the privilege but also the magnitude, that this is the one indication Jesus gives us as to what's going to happen when we stand before his Father in glory. It's interesting that many of us, myself included, can go through life so often being a little bit apathetic towards this. Maybe like the disciples who left the temple. Do we really believe it's going to be destroyed? Are we really going to come before God in this way? And we can get a bit of overconfidence and a bit of a swagger, trusting in our own ability, like we're just going to high-five our way into heaven. My dad used to sit me down and say, Carwyn, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. And I don't know if any of you have had those instances in your life where you've got a little overconfident and thought, I can just breeze through this, it's not going to be an issue. I remember when Reninka and I decided to get married and we were engaged, and you have to go and register the marriage at a registry office as an individual. And Reninka would tell you, I have a bit of a weird thing that happens in formal situations where I become very nervous. I get dry mouth, as you may be hearing this morning. Steve knows. And I start to panic. And some may have seen this in the PCC. And I went to register the marriage, and the woman said, what's your wife's first name? And I said, Reninka, and her surname, McAuliffe, and she said, and her middle name. And I froze. That's a good question. I knew it, but I panicked. Reninka's name, in fairness, is Therese Maria de los Angelos, so it was quite long, and she said, can you spell it? And I said, I can't. Can I just text my wife? And so I'm kind of texting my wife in this moment, and then we go down, and she says, and where does your wife live? And I actually said, well, I could drive you there, but I've never sent you a letter. It was absolutely humiliating. She looked over her glasses and said to me, do you actually know the woman you were asking me to give permission to marry? And I left that absolutely petrified. I was like, Reninka, I think I've totally screwed this up. We're not going to get married. I don't want that same lack of preparation when I stand before God. Francis Chan uses a similar kind of image, and there should be a picture of a gymnastics beam. Last week, my daughter had a gymnastics competition, and at the end they kind of do that whole thing. And Francis Chan was saying, wouldn't it be crazy at the Olympics if someone came on to do the beam, and instead of doing somersaults, they just clung onto it? They just lied down and clung as hard as they could for the whole 3 minutes of their routine, and then they get off and jump up and look at the judge. And Francis Chan says, what is the judge going to say to that? And then he says, but the sad truth and reality is that for many Christians, that is the exact routine that they do through life, where they get on the boom and they just hold it as tightly as possible. I don't want anything bad to happen in this life. I don't want to take any risk. I don't want anything to happen. And then we get off and we stand before God. And much like the master who comes back with the man with one silver bag of coins, he's going to say, what's going on? The charity that I work for has spent the last 3 or 4 months looking at our vision, mission and values, and studying a couple of books by a well-known author called Jim Collins, who spent his life looking at what makes some companies okay and others excellent. And he says the majority of businesses will have great vision and mission statements, but very few of them spend the time to actually align their behaviors to those missions. I'd say the majority of us in this church this morning probably know the mission statement of Jesus, but how often do we align to it? And last week, in preparation for this, I just sat down with Reninka, our kids, and we went through this list of feeding the hungry, visiting the prisoner, not as a legalistic kind of checklist, but how are we aligning to this in reality? I mean, this is serious. This is what Jesus says we're gonna face when we stand before his Father. And if some of you are at this point thinking, well, how do we do this? I want to press into this. There's two beautiful illustrations that we get in this passage that we can take as takeaways. The first is in verse 40, where it says that Jesus identifies himself with his people. It says, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me." Now, we don't have time to unpack. There's been a lot of debate as to what exactly Jesus meant by brothers and sisters, but it is clear that he came from the glory of heaven into the mess of humanity and viewed us not just as a charitable case or not just as kind of an other, but as someone who is a brother and sister. John Tyson, in his book, Beautiful Resistance, talk about how even within the faith community in recent years, there's been this growing sense of them and us, the other, and we become fearful. And Jesus says, no, I'm breaking that down. There's no such thing as other. Everyone is to be treated in the image of God. And then the other thing I love in this passage is the amount of times Jesus says, I was hungry, I was poor, I was in prison. This is a personal encounter with an individual. Mother Teresa used to say, if I look at the mass, I will never act. But if I look at the one, I will. If you're wondering how to begin on this journey, break down the barriers so that we don't view others as others, but as brothers and sisters, and just start with the one before you. And if we're wondering, well, does this stuff that he was preaching on still have the same relevance today as it did 2,000 years ago? When Jesus says, I was hungry, did you feed me? He says so in the context of 2023, where this year alone, 3 million children around the world will die from malnutrition, and 100% of those deaths are preventable. Jesus said, I was hungry, did you feed me? And Jesus doesn't say this out of some sense of guilt trip because he wants to guilt us into heaven. He does it because he doesn't want us to miss out on the most extraordinary adventure and journey that we can participate on that's been going through generations. That's the amazing thing about Edwin's dedication this morning. It's not being done out of guilt. It's being done to invite him into a family movement which has changed and transformed history. People who've taken Matthew 25 seriously. One historian said that it was Christians in the Roman Empire who had a radically different outlook on how to care for the sick. It was Christians historically who set up the first hospitals. One Roman emperor, Julian, said, if we want to keep hold of our old Roman religion, we're going to have to find a way to try and out-care how the Christians are caring. Fast forward to today's world, and there are some studies that say as many as 70% of health facilities in the developing world are run by faith communities. Agreed, not all of them are necessarily Christian faith communities, though from my experience, a very high number are. And when people take Matthew 25 seriously and join that movement through history, amazing things happen. Since 1990 to now, the global under 5 mortality rate has dropped by 59%. Isn't that incredible? And that is the journey that we are called into. At an individual level, it's about transforming and changing lives. Earlier this year, I had the privilege to go to northern Uganda to meet with some of the South Sudanese refugees that our team in East Africa work with. And there was one powerful afternoon where we were invited into this guy's small mud hut. He was profoundly disabled and explained to us how he'd spent most of his life being viewed as an animal by his community. And people used to just, mock him and abuse him. And yet our community team on the ground didn't see him just as this hopeless disabled individual. They saw him as if he were Jesus. And they enrolled him into one of our projects where he was given an acre of farmland to be able to cultivate it and given education and mentorship and seeds and tools. And as he started cultivating his land, some of the individuals from the community came and started laughing at him and saying, let's just sit and watch. How is a cripple going to cultivate a whole field? And yet he continued and he persevered with the support and the help of the community team who didn't see him as a hopeless cripple, but see him as a brother and sister and in the image of Jesus. And when it came to yielding their harvests, this humble, disabled individual found that he had one of the most successful harvests in the community. He was able to do all sorts of things to provide permanent transformation in his life. And one of the most humbling moments that he shared was the very people who'd come and mocked and laughed at him came back to his little home and apologized and said, "We're sorry." And it turned out they didn't have nearly as good a yield, and he actually ended up sharing some of his harvest with them. This is what happens when Matthew 25 is lived out. And for many of us, we don't have the opportunity to be in the far reaches of Africa or wherever it may be in the world, but it's still relevant here. John Tyson, in his book, Beautiful Resistance, calls us to make our homes hospitals. In fact, he says that the original Latin word for hospitality is rooted in the same Latin word for hospital. Most of us here probably have a home, and when Jesus says, "I was a stranger, did you welcome me?" what easier way to start on that Matthew 25 journey? Tyson says our homes are to be hospitals, refuge for healing, radiating the light of heaven. And our dinner tables should be operating tables, a place where broken souls are made whole again. One of the heroes of my faith is a guy called George Muller, who in 1836 started just inviting a few orphans into his home. He then had about 30 with his orphans with his wife, and then they ended up, we need more space. They built 5 different places that they could care for the orphans, and in their lifetime cared for over 10,000, not just out of a sense of charity. I was a stranger, and did you welcome me? When I look back at my life, one of the most profound encounters I've had with Christ was when Reninka and I had the opportunity to adopt our eldest son. Ask many people who are Christians who have adopted, you get a glimpse into how God adopted us in the most humbling and profound way. And in a country where every 15 minutes a child goes into care, maybe for some of us it's more than just opening our house once a month for a bit of hospitality, but it's making our houses a permanently holy place, a hospital for holy hospitality. There are incredible people in this church who have fostered it's a holy hospitality. Or what about the reality that we live in a day where there are more displaced people than there have been ever before? And on a Thursday night, Ryan leads a group of us who go and have a kick around playing with refugees at the K2. Why? Because the Bible says, "I was a stranger, and did you welcome me?" Daniel Strickland, as she reflects on the passage in the Bible that says Jesus came to make the invisible God visible, says this: "If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you have the privilege and the task and the responsibility of making the invisible God visible through your life." We're just going to draw to an end in a minute, but I just want us to return briefly, and the band can come up, to that first parable. What was it about that individual with one bag of silver that made them not respond in any way? And the Bible says that the master said to the guy it was laziness. And as I've been reflecting on this passage, I'm very conscious that there are times, even in this week, where if I'm honest, my faith can be lazy and apathetic. If it's a choice between listening to the Ashes on the radio or pressing into prayer, I know what often wins. I can be lazy. I'm being honest. And so for some of us, that reality is maybe true today. But it was a bit of a surprise, and I didn't expect this, but I very much felt a sense that maybe there was also a case for this guy who was given the one bag of silver, that he saw his friend get 5, and he saw another person get 2, and maybe he just felt a sense of dejection. Did he really trust his master with what he was giving, or did he compare himself to others? They've got a better ministry. They've got it all sorted. Look at their family. It's perfect. It was so easy for this guy with 1 just to maybe say, well, I'm disqualified. He's got 5. What's 1 going to do? And yet it says in 1 Peter 4:10, each of us should use whatever gifts we've received to serve others. It doesn't matter what we have, whatever we have been given, we should give. Mother Teresa said this: give the world the best you have, and it may never be enough, but give the world the best you've got anyway. I'm going to end on this story. Some of us had the privilege of going to the leadership conference, and I think it sums it up perfectly, this sense of some getting 5 bags of silver, some getting 1. And there was a guy who came on stage called Anthony Tang, who's a leading American Asian businessman who has kind of an Uber equivalent. He's worth over 995 million. And he was talking about how he uses the resources that God's given him. And then on that same day, this humble North Korean lady came up who was in her 60s and had spent several years in North Korean prisons. And she came and spoke with just a few words, but she humbly said that within that prison context, she said to God, how on earth am I meant to share Christ's love when I have nothing? She was in a cell meant for 50, but with 150 women. Every day, these were the only rations that she got. A small kind of cup of soup or gruel, whatever it was, and a mouldy corn on the cob. And she felt the Holy Spirit say to her, I want you to give 2/3 of your rations away every day, and that will demonstrate my love. And you know what she did? Every day she took 2/3 of her corn on the cob and she gave it away. She gave 2/3 of her soupy gruel and she gave it away. How easy would it have been for that woman to say, well, I've got nothing to offer, particularly in a conference where you've got a multi-millionaire, and yet she said, no, I'm going to trust God. It reminded me of the passage in Mark 12 where Jesus watched people come and gives their coins and their money in the temple. And lots of rich people run up kind of waving their checks and go, yeah, check what we're giving out. And then at the end, this humble widow comes forward and just puts a few coins in the pot, and Jesus gathers his disciples and he says, I want you to know that lady, she's the only one who's got it right. Everyone else have just given out of their wealth, but she has given all that she has in life. And so as we go into ministry time now, I think maybe there's some of us who, if we're honest, feel more like that North Korean lady in just awful situations, and what can our life count for? And I think God's calling us to trust him with whatever he's given us. And I know that's not easy, and some of you know my wife and my own testimony, struggling with infertility for many years, and then we did have children, losing our youngest son to sudden infant death syndrome and having several miscarriages afterwards. And so I don't say lightly, just, in the moments that you're at, trusting God that you can be used, but there is definitely the reality in some seasons of life where we can look at others and say, it's all right for them, they've got 5 bags of silver, but look what I've been dealt with. And Jesus says, trust me. Trust me. And so for some of you this morning, it might just be getting that trust back. Maybe others of you feel overlooked, not through bad circumstances, but just a change in life. We've had so many new babies coming in recent times, and I know we're in Inca struggle. Sometimes you want to be a prayer warrior and on the front line, and then you've suddenly got a baby and you're changing nappies and you've got sleepless nights and you're like, is this it? Is this all I've got? And God's saying, I can use you in that perfect moment. You're going to be used. Don't be like the one bag of silver guy who just buries it and say, that'll be for another day. No, press in and invest what you've been given at this time. Or maybe there's others here who have disqualified themselves because they've only got the one bag, and they say, well, of course, because if you look at my life, it's been such a mess. And as we read earlier, it said, no, we are saved by grace, not by works. A grace sufficient for every single person here. What's amazing about the story of George Muller, who's become a pioneer of the faith, that his life started out in prison with gambling problems, with drunkenness issues, with all kinds of challenges, and yet he said, no, I'm going to take this seriously. And then maybe for others of us, it's just that, if we're honest, none of that, but maybe we're just apathetic. Maybe we're just a little disbelieving like the disciples were when they left the temple. And we want to say, no, we want to get that hunger back. We want to be pioneers. When we stand before God and the 100 million angels and all the nations, and God says, did you feed the hungry? Did you care for the poor? Is there evidence of your salvation? We want to hear the wonderful and humbling words of, well done, my good and faithful servant, and get that inheritance. Isn't that an amazing and joyful opportunity that we've got today? I'm going to ask Steve to come up and lead our ministry time. But we end in the words, as Mother Teresa said, give the world the best you have, and it may never be enough. But give the world the best you've got anyway.